Sometimes the smallest human gesture can change the fate of an entire star system. The docking bay smelled like hot metal, engine oil, and the faint ozone bite of overworked plasma welders when Ethan Carter wiped sweat from his forehead and leaned back under the belly of a shuttle that definitely shouldn't have still been flying. The old cargo craft hovered 3 feet above the maintenance pad, its stabilizers whining like a tired dog, while Ethan tightened the final bolt with a ratchet that had probably seen more space than the ship itself. Around him, Docking Ring 7 buzzed with the usual chaos of the outer colonies. Freighters rumbling in from asteroid belts, cargo drones humming past with crates of mineral, ore, and the constant metallic clatter that meant someone, somewhere, was trying to keep a dying machine alive for one more jump. Ethan liked it that way. Machines were honest. They broke, you fixed them. No politics, no ceremony, no bowing to anyone important. Which was exactly why he barely noticed when the entire docking bay suddenly fell silent. It started with the lights. Rows of industrial panels along the ceiling flickered once, then shifted to a cool white glow reserved for diplomatic arrivals. A low hum rolled through the air as the massive outer bay doors opened wider than usual, revealing a sleek starship descending slowly through the vacuum shield like a silver blade cutting through water. Ethan glanced up for half a second, squinting against the glare. Huh, he muttered, sliding back out from under the shuttle. Someone important must be visiting. He didn't bother standing at attention like the rest of the dock workers suddenly did. Instead, he grabbed a rag and wiped black grease across his hands, watching casually as the elegant vessel touched down with the quiet grace of technology far more advanced than anything that belonged on this frontier station. A ramp extended with a smooth mechanical whisper. Then they appeared. Tall figures in polished armor stepped down first, their movements precise, disciplined, almost ceremonial. Their skin shimmered faintly under the docking lights, tones of deep blue and silver that caught the glow like moonlight on water. Behind them came a small procession of attendants, advisors, and officials whose clothing looked less like fabric and more like woven starlight. Ethan had seen alien diplomats before, but even he could tell this was different. People weren't just watching, they were staring. The dock workers around him slowly lowered their heads in respectful silence. Someone nearby actually dropped a wrench with a clatter and didn't even bother picking it up. And then she stepped onto the ramp. The woman at the center of the procession moved with a quiet confidence that seemed to bend the attention of the entire station toward her. She was taller than most humans, easily 6.5 feet, with skin the color of a twilight ocean and long silver hair that drifted softly behind her shoulders as if gravity itself treated her differently. Her eyes, bright gold, sharp and observant, scanned the docking bay with calm authority. Ethan blinked once. Okay, he murmured under his breath, leaning against the shuttle's landing strut. Definitely someone important. But while everyone else stood frozen in formal silence, Ethan Carter simply watched the scene with mild curiosity, completely unaware that within the next few minutes, the alien princess stepping onto that docking platform would see his face, notice one careless human smile, and decide that the future ruler of her empire had just found the man she intended to marry. Most people on Docking Ring 7 were smart enough to keep their eyes down when royalty arrived, but Ethan Carter had never been particularly good at following unwritten rules. The silver ship settled onto the landing pad with a whisper of controlled power, while the station air filled with the faint scent of ionized fuel, a clean, sharp smell that cut through the usual grease and dust of the repair bays. Ethan folded the rag over his shoulder and leaned against the shuttle strut, watching the procession the same way someone might watch an unusually expensive car roll through a neighborhood that definitely could not afford it. The armored guards moved first, tall figures with polished plates that reflected the docking lights like mirrors. Their boots touched the platform in perfect rhythm, each step measured and deliberate. Behind them walked officials wrapped in long layered garments that shimmered in subtle colors of deep violet and silver, fabrics that looked too delicate for a place that usually smelled like hot metal and hydraulic fluid. Every dock worker within 50 feet had stopped what they were doing. Tools hung frozen in midair. Cargo drones hovered patiently, waiting for the path ahead to clear. Ethan noticed the silence more than the visitors. It was rare for Docking Ring 7 to be quiet. Someone finally whispered near him, barely loud enough to hear. That is her. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Her who? Then the answer stepped forward. The woman who appeared at the top of the ramp carried herself in a way Ethan had only ever seen in historical documentaries about emperors and heads of state. She moved with calm certainty, each step unhurried but impossible to ignore. Her skin shimmered like a deep ocean under starlight, smooth blue with faint silver patterns that caught the glow of the station lamps. Long silver hair drifted across her shoulders in slow motion, as if gravity was only partially convincing her to obey it. When her golden eyes swept across the docking bay, the effect was immediate. Workers lowered their heads. A cargo pilot actually removed his cap. Even the station supervisor stood straight, like a cadet being inspected. Ethan glanced around at the sudden wave of respect and quietly scratched the back of his neck. Well, that explained the expensive ship. Royalty. He had seen recordings of alien monarchs before, but seeing one in person was different. There was a kind of quiet gravity around her, like the air itself was aware that she ruled something very large and very far away. Ethan considered returning to work. The shuttle stabilizers still needed calibration, and the customer would complain if the job was not finished within the hour. But curiosity got the better of him for a moment. He watched as the princess stepped onto the docking platform and paused, taking in the station around her. Her gaze moved slowly across the ring, observing everything with careful attention. The workers, the cargo stacks, the flickering repair lights, the battered ships that looked like they had survived 100 rough landings. For a brief moment her eyes passed over Ethan without stopping. Then something unexpected happened. A maintenance drone floating near the ceiling sputtered loudly and dropped a small crate of diagnostic tools. The metal box landed on the deck with a sharp clang that echoed through the suddenly silent bay. Several guards reacted instantly, their heads snapping toward the noise. Ethan did not react like they did. Instead, he simply chuckled under his breath, pushed himself off the shuttle strut, and walked over to pick up the scattered tools. He knelt down, gathered the wrenches and scanners, and placed them neatly back into the crate. When he stood up, he noticed that the entire royal escort was staring at him like he had just interrupted a sacred ceremony. Ethan gave a small, apologetic shrug and an easy human smile that said the moment was no big deal. And that was when the princess stopped walking. For a long moment, no one in docking ring 7 moved at all. The princess stood perfectly still on the landing platform, while the faint hum of the station ventilation drifted through the quiet air. Her golden eyes remained fixed on Ethan Carter, as if the entire docking bay had suddenly narrowed down to a single unexpected detail. Ethan noticed it immediately. When someone important stared at you in complete silence, it tended to be noticeable. He shifted the crate of tools under one arm and glanced behind himself, half expecting that the royal figure must be looking at someone else. There was no one there. Just an aging cargo shuttle, a stack of mineral containers, and a dented coffee machine that had not worked properly in 3 years. Ethan slowly turned back toward her with a puzzled expression. Around him, the dock workers remained frozen in respectful stillness. But the mechanic who had spent the last 10 years working 12-hour shifts fixing broken engines did not really know how to behave around royalty. He did the only thing that felt natural. He gave a small friendly nod, and that same relaxed smile again. The kind of smile someone offered a stranger when sharing an elevator or passing on a sidewalk. Nothing dramatic. Nothing formal. Just human. The reaction it caused was immediate and completely unexpected. Several members of the royal escort stiffened visibly as if Ethan had committed some terrible breach of protocol. One of the tall armored guards took half a step forward before stopping when the princess lifted a single hand. The gesture was small but absolute. Every guard instantly froze again. Ethan noticed that too. Well, he thought quietly, she definitely outranks them. The princess continued watching him for several seconds longer, her expression unreadable but intensely focused. Ethan suddenly became aware that the rag was still hanging over his shoulder and that a streak of grease ran across the side of his shirt. Compared to the polished elegance of the visitors, he probably looked like he had crawled out of a maintenance hatch, which, to be fair, he had done about 10 minutes earlier. He cleared his throat and shifted the crate of tools slightly. Maintenance accident, he said casually, nodding toward the drone that had dropped the crate earlier. Nothing serious. His voice carried easily across the quiet docking bay. Several dock workers stared at him in horror. No one spoke directly to royalty like that. At least, not anyone who planned to keep their job afterward. But the princess did not look offended. If anything, something curious appeared in her expression, like someone encountering an unfamiliar idea for the first time. Her golden eyes studied him carefully, observing every small detail the way a scientist might examine a newly discovered phenomenon. Then, very slowly, the corner of her mouth lifted just slightly. It was not a full smile yet, more like the beginning of one. Ethan noticed that too and gave a light shrug. "Welcome to Docking Ring 7, he added. "Things fall sometimes." For a heartbeat, the entire station seemed to hold its breath. The princess lowered her hand and took a single step forward, leaving the center of her escort behind. The guards exchanged uncertain glances but did not interfere. The distance between her and Ethan shortened by a few feet. Up close, the faint silver patterns in her blue skin glowed softly under the docking lights like reflections on calm water. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm and clear. "Human," she said slowly, as if testing the word. "Why do you smile at me?" Ethan blinked once. That was not the question he expected. He considered it for exactly 2 seconds before answering honestly. "Because you look like someone who could use one." And somewhere deep inside the silent royal escort, several advisors quietly realized something very unusual had just begun. The silence that followed Ethan Carter's answer stretched across Docking Ring 7 like a held breath. Even the cargo drones hovering near the ceiling seemed to pause in midair, as if the entire station understood that something unusual had just happened. The princess stood only a few feet away now, her tall frame illuminated by the white docking lights, while the faint silver patterns in her blue skin shimmered like reflections on water. Her golden eyes remained fixed on Ethan's face, studying him carefully. Not with anger, not with offense, with curiosity. Ethan shifted the crate of tools slightly under his arm and gave a small, uncertain shrug, the way someone might after telling a joke that nobody was quite sure how to react to. "I mean," he added calmly, "this place is not exactly cheerful. Someone has to improve the mood." A quiet ripple of shock passed through the royal attendants behind her. Several of them exchanged worried glances while one advisor lowered his voice and whispered something urgently to another. Ethan did not catch the words, but he could guess the tone. People were probably not supposed to speak casually to someone who commanded an entire fleet. The princess, however, did not appear bothered at all. In fact, the faint hint of a smile that had touched her expression earlier seemed to grow just a little stronger. It was subtle, but unmistakable. She tilted her head slightly, silver hair shifting gently across her shoulders as she continued observing him with the focused attention of someone encountering a completely new experience. "You are not afraid," she said at last, her voice calm and clear enough to echo softly through the quiet docking bay. Ethan blinked once at the question. He considered pretending to be respectful like everyone else, but that did not feel honest. "Should I be?" he replied simply. That caused another wave of visible discomfort among the royal escort. One of the armored guards actually turned his helmet slightly toward the princess, as if expecting an order. None came. Instead, she took another slow step forward, closing the distance until she stood only an arm's length away from the mechanic who still had grease on his hands and a rag on his shoulder. Up close, Ethan noticed that her eyes were even brighter than they looked from across the docking bay, a deep golden color that seemed almost luminous. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the dockworkers remained completely still, watching with the stunned expressions of people witnessing a conversation that absolutely should not be happening. Finally, the princess spoke again, her tone thoughtful. "Every individual on this station lowered their gaze when I arrived," she said. "You did not." Ethan shifted his weight and leaned one shoulder lightly against the landing strut of the shuttle behind him. "Well," he said, "someone has to keep working or these ships are not going anywhere." The princess looked at the battered cargo shuttle, the scattered repair tools, and the busy maintenance bay around them. Then she looked back at Ethan. Something about the honesty in his voice seemed to interest her more than any formal greeting could have. After another moment, she asked quietly, "What is your name, human?" Ethan straightened slightly and wiped one hand on the rag over his shoulder before answering. "Ethan Carter," he said. "Station mechanic." The princess repeated the name slowly, as if committing it to memory. "Ethan Carter." Behind her, one of the advisors inhaled sharply. Because in that moment, every member of the royal escort realized something extraordinary had just occurred. Their princess had taken a personal interest in a human mechanic from docking ring 7. The moment the princess spoke Ethan Carter's name, the quiet tension across docking ring 7 changed into something deeper, something heavier than simple curiosity. Names mattered. Everyone on the station knew that. Names were how attention turned into memory, and memory turned into consequences. Several members of the royal escort exchanged uneasy glances while the tall armored guards remained perfectly still, their polished armor reflecting the pale white glow of the docking lights. Ethan, however, simply scratched the back of his neck with the same relaxed expression he had worn since the beginning of the conversation. "That is usually the part where people introduce themselves too," he said lightly. A faint ripple of disbelief passed through the dockworkers still frozen nearby. Someone actually inhaled sharply. No one joked with royalty. At least no one who planned on keeping their job. The princess watched him for another quiet second, studying his tone, his posture, and the strange calm that seemed to surround him. Then she spoke again, her voice carrying the same smooth clarity as before. "I am Lyra Velis." She paused briefly, as if deciding how much of the title mattered in this moment. "Crown Princess of the Veilorian Sovereignty." The words settled into the docking bay like the soft echo of a bell. Even Ethan could feel the weight behind that title. A sovereignty meant star systems, fleets, and more people than he could imagine. Ethan gave a slow nod. "That explains the fancy ship," he said. One of the advisors behind her visibly winced. But Lyra did not look offended. Instead, she seemed thoughtful, almost amused by the mechanic's straightforward reaction. Her golden eyes drifted briefly across the maintenance bay again, taking in the scattered tools, the hovering drones, and the battered cargo shuttle Ethan had been repairing. "You maintain vessels here," she said. Ethan lifted the crate of tools slightly in response. "That is the idea." He gestured toward the aging shuttle beside him. "Most ships that reach this ring have already had a rough trip." Lyra studied the vessel carefully, observing the worn plating, the exposed maintenance panels, and the careful work Ethan had been doing beneath the stabilizer assembly. For someone raised among the shining hulls of a royal fleet, the place must have looked primitive. Yet there was something honest about it. Something alive. "You repair what others abandon," she said quietly. Ethan shrugged. "Machines deserve a second chance." The princess seemed to consider that answer more seriously than he expected. Her gaze returned to his face again, thoughtful and steady. "You smiled before you knew who I was," she said. Ethan nodded once. "Yes." "Why?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity, not accusation. Ethan leaned back against the shuttle strut again and folded his arms. "Because people look better when they are not surrounded by guards and worried advisors," he said. "And because you looked like someone who had not heard a normal conversation in a while." Another uneasy whisper passed through the royal attendants. Lyra did not react to them. Her attention remained entirely on Ethan Carter, the mechanic who had somehow spoken to her more honestly in 5 minutes than most diplomats had in years. Slowly, the faint smile returned to her face again. This time it stayed. And in that quiet moment, standing in the middle of a noisy repair bay on the edge of civilized space, Princess Lyra Velis realized something that surprised even herself. For the first time since stepping onto the station, she felt comfortable. The quiet comfort that had settled over the conversation lasted only a few seconds before reality slowly returned to docking ring 7. A distant cargo engine roared to life somewhere along the outer ring, and the familiar rhythm of the station began creeping back into the background. But around Ethan Carter and Princess Lyra Velis, the silence still lingered like an invisible boundary that no one else seemed willing to cross. The royal advisors remained several steps behind their princess, whispering urgently among themselves while trying not to appear as though they were whispering at all. One of them, a tall figure wrapped in layered violet robes, finally leaned closer to the armored captain of the guard and spoke in a quiet voice. "Your Highness has been standing in a maintenance bay for 3 minutes, he murmured. "The diplomatic council is waiting." The guard gave the smallest nod, but did not interrupt. Lyra's attention was still entirely focused on the human mechanic in front of her. Ethan, meanwhile, had begun carefully placing the recovered tools back into the crate he had been holding earlier. The small metal wrenches clinked softly against each other as he worked. When he finished, he slid the crate onto a nearby tool cart and wiped his hands again with the rag hanging over his shoulder. "Well," he said lightly, glancing toward the elegant starship that had brought her here, "I imagine people are waiting for you." Lyra followed his gaze briefly toward the vessel, its sleek hull glowing faintly under the station lights. She knew very well that dozens of officials, diplomats, and officers were currently waiting inside the station council chamber for her arrival. Protocol demanded that she greet them immediately, yet for some reason the thought felt less urgent than it should have. She looked back at Ethan. "They can wait a moment longer," she said calmly. The advisors behind her stiffened again. Ethan raised one eyebrow with mild amusement. "You are probably the only person in this station who can say that." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "Does that trouble you?" Ethan shook his head. "Not really. I just fix ships." He reached down and picked up a small diagnostic scanner from the cart beside him. Turning it over in his hand, as if remembering the job he had been doing before the royal arrival interrupted the afternoon. The battered cargo shuttle behind him gave a faint mechanical whine as its stabilizer recalibration cycle continued running. Lyra glanced at the machine again, her curiosity clearly returning. "This vessel belongs to you?" she asked. Ethan laughed softly. "I wish. No. It belongs to a trader who will complain loudly if I do not finish the repair before the hour is over." The princess considered that answer with interest. "And yet you stopped working when I arrived." Ethan shrugged. "Well, when an entire royal fleet lands outside, your workshop, it tends to get your attention." That earned a quiet smile from her again. She stepped closer to the shuttle, studying the open maintenance panel and the web of cables Ethan had been adjusting earlier. The guards immediately shifted position, watching carefully but still respecting the boundary she had created around this unexpected conversation. Lyra placed one hand lightly against the cool metal surface of the ship. "You understand these machines very well," she said. Ethan leaned beside her and glanced at the stabilizer assembly. "They make sense," he replied. "Every part has a reason to exist." The princess looked back at him thoughtfully. "People are rarely so simple." Ethan chuckled quietly. "That is true." For a brief moment, they simply stood there together beside the aging cargo shuttle, surrounded by the noise and motion of a working space station. Then Lyra asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the beginning of their conversation. "Ethan Carter," she said slowly, "would you show me how you repair a ship?" And somewhere behind her, 3 royal advisors nearly stopped breathing. For a moment, Ethan Carter simply stared at Princess Lyra Velis, as if he had misheard her. Around them, docking ring 7 continued humming with the distant noise of engines and cargo lifts, but the small circle of space between the mechanic and the princess remained strangely quiet. Ethan leaned back slightly against the landing strut of the cargo shuttle and gave a short breath of amused disbelief. "You want to learn how to repair a ship?" he repeated slowly. Lyra met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." Behind her, the reaction was immediate. One of the advisors nearly dropped the datapad he had been holding while another leaned forward in alarm. "Your Highness," the robed advisor began carefully, his voice low but urgent, "that is not necessary. The council chamber is prepared and the diplomatic delegation has been waiting." Lyra lifted one hand without even turning around. The advisor stopped speaking instantly. The mechanic watched the exchange with mild interest. "You have very efficient advisors," Ethan said quietly. "They are dedicated," Lyra replied. "Sometimes excessively so." Ethan chuckled under his breath. He picked up the diagnostic scanner from the tool cart again and glanced at the open stabilizer assembly of the cargo shuttle. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "repairing a ship is not exactly royal entertainment." Lyra stepped closer to the exposed panel, her attention returning to the machine. The faint glow of the docking lights reflected across the smooth blue surface of her skin, while the silver patterns along her arms shimmered gently. "It interests me," she said simply. Ethan studied her expression for a moment. There was no trace of humor or mockery there. She genuinely wanted to understand. The mechanic finally gave a small shrug. "All right," he said, "but if something gets greasy, it is not my fault." That earned another faint smile from the princess. Ethan set the scanner down on the edge of the maintenance panel and gestured toward the open compartment beneath the shuttle's stabilizer housing. A cluster of cables and compact thruster regulators filled the space, each one labeled with faded service markings. "First rule," he said, pointing inside the compartment. Every ship breaks for a reason. Lyra leaned forward slightly, studying the components with focused curiosity. Explain. Ethan tapped one of the stabilizer conduits gently with the back of a wrench. This vessel is nearly 20 years old. The trader who owns it runs cargo through the asteroid belt. That means constant vibration and dust. He pointed to a narrow metal seam along the regulator housing. That vibration slowly loosens this joint. Once it shifts by even a quarter of an inch, the stabilizer starts compensating incorrectly. Lyra watched carefully as he demonstrated, her golden eyes following every movement of his hands. And the vessel becomes unstable during flight, she concluded. Ethan gave an approving nod. Exactly. The advisors behind her exchanged another uneasy glance. Their princess was crouched beside a human mechanic in a maintenance bay listening to a lesson about thruster regulators. This was not a situation covered in diplomatic protocol manuals. Lyra reached toward the open panel and hesitated. May I? Ethan handed her the small wrench he had been using earlier. Go ahead. The princess carefully adjusted the stabilizer joint the same way he had shown her. When the metal clicked softly into place, the faint whining sound from the shuttle's stabilizer system immediately quieted. Lyra straightened slowly, holding the tool in her hand. For a moment, she looked almost surprised. It worked, she said softly. Ethan leaned against the shuttle again with a satisfied grin. Machines appreciate attention, he replied. And as the quiet hum of the repaired stabilizer filled the docking bay, Princess Lyra Velis realized that learning how a simple human mechanic fixed broken machines was far more interesting than any diplomatic meeting waiting for her elsewhere on the station. The soft hum of the stabilizer settling into proper alignment filled the maintenance bay with a steady mechanical rhythm that sounded almost satisfied. Princess Lyra Velis slowly turned the small wrench in her hand, as if examining a rare artifact, the polished metal reflecting the pale white lights of docking ring 7. For a brief moment, she simply listened to the repaired shuttle, the machine no longer whining or struggling against its own imbalance. It changed immediately, she said quietly. Ethan Carter nodded, leaning his shoulder casually against the shuttle's landing strut. Machines usually tell you what they need if you pay attention, he replied. Lyra looked back toward the open stabilizer panel with thoughtful curiosity. For someone who had grown up surrounded by advanced royal engineering, the simplicity of the repair seemed almost surprising. The stabilizer housing contained no glowing crystal arrays or elegant alien circuitry, only rugged human parts bolted together with practical logic. Your people build machines very differently than ours, she said. Ethan shrugged lightly. Probably because our machines break more often. The answer made her pause for a moment, and then a quiet laugh escaped her before she could stop it. It was soft and genuine, the kind of sound that did not belong in a formal throne room or a diplomatic council chamber. Several dockworkers nearby exchanged confused looks. None of them had ever heard an alien princess laugh inside a repair bay before. Behind her, the royal advisors appeared even more unsettled than before. One of them leaned toward the captain of the guard again and whispered urgently, "This situation is becoming unusual." The guard did not respond, but his helmet slowly turned as he watched the princess speaking casually with the mechanic beside the battered cargo shuttle. Lyra set the wrench carefully back onto the tool cart and brushed a faint trace of metallic dust from her fingertips. The gesture was small, but Ethan noticed it. "First repair lesson," he said. "Grease happens." She glanced at the faint mark on her hand and seemed almost amused. "I see." Her golden eyes lifted again toward Ethan, studying him with that same thoughtful curiosity that had followed every word he spoke since their conversation began. "You treat this work with respect," she observed. Ethan looked briefly at the cargo shuttle, the worn metal panels, and the open maintenance compartment. "Ships carry people across impossible distances," he said. "They deserve someone who cares whether they make it home." The answer seemed to resonate with her more deeply than he expected. Lyra looked across the busy docking ring where dozens of freighters and transport vessels rested between long journeys. For the first time since arriving on the station, she was seeing the place not as a diplomatic waypoint, but as a living system where ordinary people kept entire trade routes alive. "On my home world," she said slowly, "repairs are handled by automated systems and fleet engineers. I have never seen the process so personal." Ethan gave a small grin. Humans tend to get personally involved with their problems. The princess considered that quietly. Around them the station had returned to its usual motion. Cargo loaders rolled past in the distance, and a small shuttle lifted slowly from a neighboring pad, its engines glowing blue as it rose toward the open docking gate. Lyra watched the departing vessel for a moment before turning back to Ethan Carter. "I understand something now," she said. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "What is that?" Lyra met his gaze directly, the faint smile returning to her face again. "Why you smiled at me?" Ethan raised one eyebrow with mild curiosity. "And why is that?" The princess's answer came with calm certainty. "Because to you, I was simply another person standing in the wrong place." And for reasons she could not fully explain, that realization made the human mechanic standing beside her far more interesting than anyone waiting in the station's diplomatic chamber. Princess Lyra Velas held Ethan Carter's gaze for several quiet seconds after speaking those words, as if the realization itself was something new and fragile. Around them, docking ring 7 continued its endless cycle of arrivals and departures. A freighter engine rumbled somewhere beyond the maintenance bay, and the faint smell of heated metal drifted through the air again as another crew began welding repairs on a neighboring vessel. Yet the small space beside the battered cargo shuttle still felt strangely separate from the rest of the station. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck with the rag over his shoulder and gave a small half-smile. "That was the idea," he said simply. Lyra studied his expression carefully. In the royal courts of her home system, every word spoken to her was measured, calculated, and carefully wrapped in formality. Conversations were layered with intention, strategy, and political meaning. But Ethan Carter had spoken to her the same way he spoke to everyone else on the station. Directly, without hesitation, without expectation of reward. The realization seemed to linger in her mind like the echo of a new language she was just beginning to understand. "Where I come from," she said slowly. "People rarely behave that way." Ethan leaned slightly against the tool cart and folded his arms. "People usually behave differently when they think someone is important." Lyra nodded once. "Yes." She glanced briefly toward the royal ship resting on the landing platform beyond the repair bay. The elegant vessel shimmered under the station lights like something that did not quite belong in a place filled with cargo haulers and mining transports. "Titles change how others see you," she said. Ethan followed her gaze toward the ship. "Titles change how people think they are supposed to act." Lyra turned back toward him again, thoughtful. "And you?" Ethan shrugged. "I fix stabilizers and engine couplings." "Titles do not help with that." The simplicity of the answer drew another faint smile from her. Behind them, the advisors had grown noticeably restless. One of them finally stepped forward cautiously, clearing his throat in a respectful attempt to regain the princess's attention. "Your Highness," he said gently, "the diplomatic council is now 20 minutes behind schedule." Lyra did not look away from Ethan immediately. Instead, she seemed to weigh the situation for a quiet moment before acknowledging the advisor with a small nod. "Thank you," she said calmly. The advisor bowed slightly and stepped back again, though his expression suggested the entire royal delegation was still struggling to understand what they were witnessing. Ethan pushed himself upright from the tool cart and glanced toward the cargo shuttle behind him. The stabilizer indicator light had turned green, signaling that the repair cycle was complete. He tapped the side of the hull lightly with his knuckles, satisfied. "Looks like that one is ready to fly again," he said. Lyra followed the motion of his hand, observing the quiet pride in the mechanic's voice. "You sound pleased." Ethan smiled slightly. "A ship that leaves here working properly means someone makes it home." The princess considered that answer in silence. There was something deeply human about the way he measured success. Not in titles, not in power, but in whether someone arrived safely at the end of a long journey. Finally, she turned toward the royal landing platform again. "I should attend the council," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Probably a good idea." She took a step away from the shuttle, then paused and looked back at him once more. The faint smile returned to her face again. "Ethan Carter," she said. "Yes. I am glad the drone dropped that crate." Ethan blinked once in mild confusion before chuckling softly. "Me too." And as the princess began walking back toward the waiting royal delegation, several members of her escort exchanged uneasy glances. Because they had all noticed the same thing. Their princess was leaving the docking bay, but her thoughts were very clearly still standing beside a human mechanic and a repaired cargo shuttle. Princess Lyra Velis walked slowly across the docking platform toward her waiting delegation, but the steady rhythm of her steps did not match the quiet storm of thoughts moving through her mind. The polished floor beneath her reflected the bright station lights and the sleek silhouette of her royal vessel. Yet her attention drifted back toward the repair bay behind her again and again. She could still hear the faint metallic hum of the cargo shuttle stabilizer Ethan Carter had repaired only moments earlier. It was a small sound, ordinary by any technical standard, yet it lingered in her memory far more clearly than the carefully prepared diplomatic speeches waiting inside the station council chamber. Behind her, the royal escort moved quickly to re-establish their formal formation. Advisors checked their datapads, guards adjusted their positions, and the captain of the security detail stepped forward slightly as they approached the main docking corridor that led toward the administrative wing of the station. The captain lowered his voice respectfully. "Your Highness, the council representatives from 5 systems have gathered. They are prepared to discuss the Trade Corridor Treaty." Lyra nodded once, acknowledging the information, but her gaze shifted briefly across the docking ring again. The maintenance bay where Ethan Carter worked had already returned to its normal rhythm. Dock workers moved equipment, drones floated between cargo stacks, and somewhere in the distance the mechanic himself had likely returned to finishing the rest of his repair work. The ordinary movement of the station felt strangely grounding compared to the quiet formality surrounding her now. One of the advisors finally spoke again, his tone carefully measured. "Your Highness, the Council has been anticipating this meeting for several weeks. The stability of the trade routes depends heavily on today's discussion." Lyra slowed her pace slightly as they entered the wide corridor leading toward the council chamber. Transparent observation windows lined the wall to her right, revealing the vast open docking ring beyond. Through the glass, she could still see the maintenance platforms where hundreds of workers kept the station alive every day. She thought again of Ethan leaning casually against that battered cargo shuttle, explaining a stabilizer joint as if he were discussing something as natural as breathing. Machines deserve a second chance. The words returned to her mind unexpectedly. Lyra finally spoke, her voice calm but thoughtful. "Tell me," she said quietly to the advisor walking beside her, "how many ships pass through this station each week?" The advisor blinked slightly at the unexpected question but quickly checked his datapad. "Approximately 4,000 civilian vessels, Your Highness. Mining transports, cargo freighters, passenger shuttles, and independent traders." Lyra looked again through the observation window at the endless movement of ships arriving and departing. "And how many mechanics maintain them?" The advisor hesitated briefly before answering. "A few hundred station technicians, according to the Port Authority records." The princess nodded slowly, absorbing the scale of the system. Entire economies depended on places like this. And people like Ethan Carter kept those systems running without recognition or ceremony. The corridor doors ahead opened automatically as the royal delegation approached, revealing the grand entrance to the station council chamber. Inside, diplomats and representatives from several star systems were already seated around a long curved table beneath the glow of holographic star maps. The advisors straightened immediately, returning fully to their formal roles. Lyra paused at the threshold for just a second before stepping inside. Yet even as the council members rose respectfully to greet her arrival, a quiet thought remained at the back of her mind. In a maintenance bay not far from the council chamber, a human mechanic was probably tightening bolts and adjusting engines without the slightest awareness that a royal princess was already wondering when she might see him again. The council chamber of Docking Ring 7 was designed to impress anyone who stepped inside. A wide circular hall stretched nearly 100 feet across, its ceiling lined with softly glowing panels that displayed a rotating map of nearby star systems. At the center stood a long curved table of polished metal where diplomats, trade representatives, and station officials were already seated. When Princess Lyra Velis entered the chamber, every conversation stopped immediately. Chairs shifted. Several representatives stood in respectful greeting. The room carried the quiet tension of people who understood they were about to negotiate matters that affected entire trade routes across multiple systems. Lyra walked calmly to the central position prepared for her, her posture graceful and composed in the way royal training demanded. Yet while the diplomats watched her every movement with careful attention, her thoughts drifted for a brief moment back to the docking ring outside. She could still picture the battered cargo shuttle, the scattered tools, and the relaxed human mechanic who had spoken to her without hesitation. The council chairman, an elderly representative from the Centauri Trade Authority, cleared his throat respectfully. "Your Highness, we are honored by your presence. The proposed stabilization of the outer corridor shipping lanes is of great importance to every system represented here." Lyra inclined her head politely. "Then we should begin." A series of holographic charts illuminated above the table as the chairman activated the display. Colored trade routes stretched across the projected star map, like glowing threads connecting dozens of worlds. Freight capacity numbers, taxation models, and transit projections filled the air between them. The chairman continued explaining the proposed agreements while several delegates added their own comments about security patrols, docking tariffs, and infrastructure funding. Lyra listened carefully. She had attended council negotiations since childhood and understood every detail being discussed. Yet something about the conversation felt distant today, like hearing familiar music from another room. Her gaze shifted briefly toward one of the observation windows along the far wall of the chamber. Through the glass, she could see a portion of the docking ring outside. Tiny cargo ships moved slowly through the station's massive gates, while maintenance lights flickered across the outer platforms. Somewhere out there, Ethan Carter was probably tightening another bolt or adjusting another stabilizer joint without the slightest awareness that a Royal Council meeting was taking place only a few corridors away. One of the trade delegates leaned forward with interest. "Your Highness," he said respectfully, "the Sovereignty Fleet's escort vessels would ensure safe passage through the corridor if the treaty is signed. Your support would stabilize commerce for decades." Lyra returned her attention to the discussion, her expression thoughtful. The council members waited patiently for her response. The decision truly did matter. A single agreement could reshape the movement of goods and travelers across half a dozen star systems. Yet as she studied the glowing map above the table, another thought quietly surfaced in her mind. Every glowing line on that map represented ships traveling vast distances. And every ship depended on someone, somewhere, keeping its engines running. She remembered the quiet confidence in Ethan's voice when he said a ship deserved someone who cared whether it made it home. Lyra folded her hands gently on the table and looked around the chamber at the assembled delegates. "Trade routes are not stabilized only by fleets and treaties," she said calmly. The representatives exchanged curious glances. "They are stabilized by the countless individuals who keep those ships moving every day." The chairman tilted his head slightly, uncertain where the statement was leading. Lyra allowed a faint smile to touch her expression before continuing. "Before we discuss escort fleets and tariffs," she said, "tell me how this treaty will support the stations and technicians who maintain the corridor itself." The diplomats blinked in surprise, because none of them had expected the princess to begin the negotiation by asking about mechanics. The council chamber grew noticeably quieter after Princess Lyra Velis asked her unexpected question. For a moment, several of the delegates simply looked at one another as if they were trying to confirm they had heard her correctly. Trade treaties usually revolved around numbers, fleets, tariffs, and political alliances. Mechanics and maintenance workers were rarely mentioned in negotiations between star systems. The chairman of the council adjusted the small data pad in front of him and cleared his throat carefully. "Your Highness," he said respectfully, "station maintenance operations are normally managed by the individual port authorities. The treaty primarily focuses on shipping security and cargo taxation." Lyra studied the holographic star map hovering above the table. Hundreds of glowing trade routes stretched between distant systems, each one representing ships traveling thousands of miles through open space. "And if the ports that maintain those vessels are underfunded?" she asked calmly. "How long will those trade routes remain stable?" The delegates shifted slightly in their seats. Several advisors began quietly reviewing data on their displays, while others exchanged thoughtful glances. It was a simple question, but it forced them to consider something they had overlooked. Lyra continued, her voice steady but thoughtful. "A fleet can protect a convoy from external threats," she said. "But no escort can repair a failing stabilizer joint or a damaged engine coil. As she spoke, her eyes drifted briefly toward the observation window again. Through the transparent glass, she could see the faint glow of repair lights across the outer docking platforms. Somewhere out there, Ethan Carter was likely finishing another repair with the same quiet focus he had shown earlier. The chairman leaned forward slowly, his tone more careful now. Your Highness raises an important operational point. If maintenance stations along the corridor were strengthened, cargo delays and technical incidents would decrease significantly. One of the trade delegates nodded thoughtfully. Improved repair infrastructure would increase route reliability. Insurance rates alone would drop across the corridor. Another representative added, that could increase total cargo throughput by several % annually. Lyra listened to the shifting tone of the discussion with quiet satisfaction. The conversation had moved exactly where she intended. The holographic charts adjusted as new projections appeared in the air above the table. The diplomats who had initially focused only on tariffs and fleet patrols were now examining maintenance budgets and port support systems. One of the younger council analysts looked up from his calculations and spoke with cautious enthusiasm. If the treaty allocated even a small percentage of corridor revenue toward station maintenance grants, the improvement across multiple ports would be immediate. Lyra nodded once. Then it seems logical to include such provisions. The chairman smiled slightly, recognizing the direction the negotiation had taken. Your Highness has broadened the discussion in a most constructive way. Yet as the council continued examining the new proposals, Lyra felt a quiet sense of clarity settle in her thoughts. Earlier that day, she had watched a single mechanic solve a problem with nothing more than a wrench, patience, and attention to detail. That moment had shown her something no diplomatic briefing ever had. Entire systems functioned because ordinary people cared enough to keep them running. When the council paused briefly to reorganize their data projections, one of the advisors seated beside Lyra leaned closer and spoke softly. Your Highness, he said, that was an unusual negotiation approach. Lyra allowed the faintest smile to return to her expression. Perhaps, she replied. Then she looked once more through the observation window, toward the busy docking ring beyond the council chamber. Somewhere among the repair platforms and cargo bays, a human mechanic had unknowingly changed the direction of an interstellar trade treaty. The discussion in the council chamber continued for nearly another hour, but by the time the final projections faded from the air above the long metal table, the direction of the treaty had already changed. What began as a negotiation about tariffs and fleet escorts had quietly evolved into something broader. Station maintenance funding, repair infrastructure, and technician support programs were now written directly into the corridor agreement. The delegates who had first appeared surprised were now nodding in agreement as revised figures appeared on their displays. The chairman finally leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression. Then we are in consensus, he announced. The Corridor Stabilization Treaty will include a dedicated infrastructure allocation for the stations along the route. Several representatives voiced their approval. The decision would strengthen dozens of outposts and repair hubs scattered across multiple systems. Lyra Velis folded her hands calmly on the table while the room settled into a quiet sense of accomplishment. For the diplomats present, the meeting had been a successful negotiation. For Lyra, however, the moment carried a more personal significance. She glanced once more toward the observation window on the far wall of the chamber. Outside, the docking ring still moved with its constant rhythm of arrivals and departures. Freighters drifted slowly through the station gates while maintenance drones floated between the outer platforms like small mechanical fireflies. Somewhere in that busy web of motion, Ethan Carter was still doing what he had done every day before she arrived, fixing ships that needed someone to care whether they made it home. The chairman stood and offered a respectful bow. Your Highness, your insight today has greatly strengthened the agreement. Lyra rose gracefully from her seat. It was a productive discussion, she replied politely. The council members began gathering their datapads and documents while the royal advisors quietly approached her again. One of them spoke with careful curiosity. Your Highness, the delegation transport is ready whenever you wish to return to the vessel. Lyra nodded, but instead of walking directly toward the exit, she paused beside the observation window again. For a brief moment, she simply watched the outer docking platforms. The advisors waited patiently behind her, unsure whether she was still considering the treaty or simply reflecting on the meeting. Finally, she turned back toward them. Before we depart, she said calmly, there is one place I would like to visit again. The advisors exchanged brief, confused glances. Of course, Your Highness, one of them replied. Where would you like to go? Lyra allowed a small, thoughtful smile to appear again, the same quiet expression that had first appeared in the maintenance bay earlier that day. Docking ring 7, she said. Maintenance platform 3. The advisor blinked in mild surprise, but quickly nodded. We will prepare the route immediately. As the royal delegation began moving toward the corridor exit, Lyra walked with the same calm composure she had shown all day. Yet this time her steps carried a quiet sense of anticipation. Because somewhere among the repair platforms and cargo ships, a human mechanic named Ethan Carter had no idea that the princess he had spoken to so casually that morning was already on her way back to find him again.